Okay, we've talked a little bit about Whitman, about the about content, what he's sort of proclaiming in his poems, right? I'm the poet of the body and the poet of the soul. I'm the poet of the man and the woman, etc. But now let's talk about form. The form here is obviously different than the poems that you read last week. So let's ask ourselves if that's mere coincidence, or if the form of these poems, or this one long poem, plays an important role, maybe equally important to, or even more important than, the role of the content. What's one of the first things that you noticed about Whitman's poems? For me, it's the lack of rhyme, which is a kind of ornament or artifice, and the length of the lines. Well, if we think closely about these two things, they make perfect sense, right? In the previous video, we saw that Whitman is a poet of the common person. His speech, while I consider it masterful and artful, lacks the typical ornamentation that accompanies most other poetry of the day. By that I mean it lacks meter and regular meter and rhyme. These are changes to the sound of the poem, but the poem also looks different on the page, doesn't it? The lines are sprawling and vast, just as he seems to have a limitless supply of characters in his poems. So in order to fit everything into his poem, in order to visually suggest that Whitman is an expansive poet, a poet with his arms wide open, he uses long lines. They overflow the margin. So if you're reading these poems and you see that the line overflows and begins again on the next line but is indented, the indented line is actually not a new line. It's an overflow of the previous line. So all new lines start flush on the left margin, and then the lines that begin indented are just overflow from the previous part of the line. So sort of a technical thing, but that just demonstrates to you how long Whitman's lines are. The use of a visually long line also affects the sound of the poem. So it's not just a visual thing, it's a sound thing. It gives the reader, or Whitman himself, whoever you sort of imagine speaking the poem out loud, it gives that person plenty of time to gather momentum and energy. At its core, that's one of the things Whitman's poetry focuses on the most, the vibrancy of human sensations, sight, sound, touch, etc. Whitman is a poet of excess, and the long lines visually demonstrate that excess because they cannot physically be contained within the margins.